Welcome everybody to our ERP Implementation Rescue webinar. I'm so delighted to be joined by Andrea Jones Consulting, a strategic partner of ours and experts in project management. And we put our heads together, and one thing we have been seeing a lot of times and just historically are ERP implementations that go sideways. And you actually never know if you're on the right track or if you're off the beaten track until it's too late. So we thought we would put together this Q&A and this expert panel of project managers to talk about, do's, don'ts, and signs of implementations that may just be going wrong. So I just wanted to quickly do a round of introductions. My name is Gregory Petrosian. I am at CSG Pro. We are a data solutions and custom software firm here in Portland, Oregon. And I will hand it off to Andrea.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And thanks again for having us on today. My name is Andrea Jones, and I own AJC, which is Andrea Jones Consulting. We do project management, change management, process improvement consulting. And I would say ERP implementations allow us to fire on all of those cylinders. So we're very pleased to be here today.
Thanks.
And Barry?
Yep, thanks, Andrea, and thanks everybody for joining our meeting today. My name is Barry Chapman. I am, for people that are familiar with EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System, I am the integrator for AJC, and I also do some consulting as well and account management, and I'm managing one of our ERP rescue projects right now. So be happy to share some insight on what's going on with that particular project. Thanks.
Awesome. And then finally, I'm Gavin McLaughlin. I'm also a CSG Pro. I'll be emceeing and facilitating today. I work as a business transformation consultant here at CSG. I kind of work as a mixture of an account manager and strategic consultant, which means that day to day, I'm really making sure our technical work aligns with our client's strategic needs. I was mentioning earlier pre-call that, I kind of cut my teeth in the ERP world and pharmaceutical supply chain. And, one of my main clients was in this rapid growth acquisition phase. They had over 47 different ERPs across 70 plants. So needless to say, I'm already sold on the need for roles and skill sets that can provide clarity through that kind of complexity. And, knowing where we are in the year as we kind of, start rounding that final turn into Q4, we know that this is also a time of year when people are refocusing on projects, what needs to be done by the end of the year, what needs to be in place for Q1 2021, and are we on track with all of that? And kind of with that in mind, I'll hop right into that first question of, ERP implementations are notorious for taking a long time to implement. What might be going on in an ERP implementation that would cause a company to believe that their project may be going off track rather than just taking a long time like they all do?
Thanks, Gavin. That's a great question. So it's true, ERP implementations are very notorious for taking forever. Nobody wants that to happen, of course. So I would say the key indicator that you want to look at is, one, that you have a milestone schedule of some kind, right? And two, are your milestone dates continually slipping? So we actually aren't super big fans of the detailed upfront waterfall schedule. We do try to be a little bit more agile in our approach. And so people will ask me if Agile and project managing something like an ERP are at odds. And I'd say no, but you do need to have some kind of structure. There's some major things that happen in an ERP. There's data migration, there are conference room pilots, there are user acceptance testing. If there's any kind of integrations or any customizations at work, those things have to be well understood, and there's a lot of people that have to work together. So you do need some big milestones and you need some basic durations. And if you constantly see those slipping, that's a pretty good indicator that you're off track.
Got it. And then I always kind of think of that Pareto 80-20 rule. Where would you say the bulk of projects go off track?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is true in not just ERP, but projects in general. People really underestimate the amount of time and dedication it takes to do something. And what we typically see is people think that they can get stuff done in a certain amount of time, and that isn't possible. Maybe they have other things on their plate, or the data migration was more complicated than they thought. Possibly those integrations and customizations I mentioned are more complicated than they thought. I think I consider myself an optimistic realist. And so what that means is I like to think things will go well, but I'm a realist in that I understand that even something that maybe seems simple, like, oh yeah, just move all your data into this system, you just download it and then re-upload it, that is just not as straightforward as people might like it to be. So I would say 80% of the problems are in underestimating some of that heavy lift. And then of course, people having other distractions or other focuses that keep them from really executing work for the priority.
We see that time and time again a lot in our work as well. And I think you have to be an optimist just always if you want to, you know, for quality of life, and also just making sure you can rah-rah the team. But you have to bring it down to earth too. Things are never straightforward in technology. What you expect to happen usually never does. And so having that realistic lens and being able to prepare for the worst is so important.
Yeah. And I mean, I also think, you know, what we see in our work in the technology side is just, you know, people do underestimate that, like, what it takes to actually get things done. But then they're also not ready to necessarily catch the ball when the process change piece comes into place. And it's always interesting seeing that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've seen that a lot too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, like, what about the vendor's project manager? Why can't that person kind of help keep things in line and shore up the schedule?
Thanks for asking. I feel like obviously I have a project management company, so I'm going to answer in a certain way, but I have this company for a reason. So people ask us that all the time. Hey, the vendor has a PM. Why do I need to hire another PM? Isn't that, you know, wasting my money? I would say a couple of things. The vendor, of course, will have a PM, and they should. If they don't, that's a red flag. But the vendor's project manager is really focused on the vendor. The vendor will have a schedule as well. They need to be kept to that schedule. They have follow-up and activities that they need to be held accountable for as well. So the vendor's project manager is really working with their own team to keep them on track, and they expect that the client's team will be able to keep themselves on track and aligned to that schedule. The other thing is the vendor doesn't have any visibility necessarily into some additional things that you might be concerned about. So for example, Gavin, you already said training and adoption with end users, the vendor doesn't have that on their scope. Considering the process flows and the way that you used to be doing things and putting them in the new system, you know, they might help you with some of that in the configuration, but they might not understand fully all of the nuances of your old process that have to go into the system, and they don't necessarily want to be dragging that out of you. They're not going to see your own calendar. They're not going to be able to schedule meetings when you have time, right? So they're really focused on themselves. And I talked with a woman who's an analyst for a pretty big ERP company recently. She told me at that ERP, the project managers had about 10 projects going at a time. So at best, if you are one of 10 projects that a project manager is considering, you're getting 4 hours of their time a week at best. It's usually not enough to keep your project going. Barry, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think the disclaimer is the PMs for the vendors are very good. They're very experienced. They've done implementations before, but as you're hearing, it's from kind of their side of the house, and so you can't expect the vendor's project manager to be managing your team. They're going to manage their team. They're going to manage the schedules and going to expect that the client is going to have the resources to get those things done, but that vendor project manager isn't going to be herding the cattle, so to speak, on the client side. So it's really important to keep that in mind. We are currently involved with a project right now that actually is a rescue. And I think the client's expectations were that the PM for the vendor would help them along. And about 6 months into the project, they found out they were off track because the vendor PM wasn't doing that. which was no fault of theirs. And as was said earlier, I think people in the companies, everybody has full-time jobs, and so they're being asked to do additional work, and they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do that. And so that's why it's important to make sure you've got somebody that can be fully dedicated on the company side to make sure that the project's staying on track. So that's kind of been my personal experience with one we're involved with right now today.
Nice. And then so ERPs are a huge investment for most organizations. Every once in a while you'll see those news stories of Nike's spending hundreds of millions to do this, SAP install, or, whichever company. And even in smaller organizations, it still represents a huge portion of their revenue and budget. And so with that in mind, how do you talk about ROI of hiring another vendor to come in and PM a project?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's definitely a concern. I would say there's a few things. One, I would consider the opportunity cost of having someone in-house doing it. So we've seen, it might be the accounting manager or the controller. Maybe it's the customer service manager or an operations manager or somebody else. If you want to dedicate someone internally to do that, what are they not going to be able to do that really affects your bottom line that they'll have to give up in order to manage this project effectively? So really consider that opportunity cost. The other thing, we actually really believe that project management for an ERP doesn't necessarily have to be a full-time job. And at AJC, we are happy to do this on a part-time basis to fit the client's needs. So the project Barry mentioned earlier, when we talked to that client the first time, they thought they needed a full-time project manager, and we talked to them about it and what they thought they needed in the scope of work and all those questions. And at the end of it, we said, there definitely are some weeks you'll want someone full-time, and we're happy to provide that, but we don't think you need that all the time. So we are also happy to be as flexible as we can be with that budget, and consider their overall needs and partner in a way that makes sense for both. So it is an investment. Think about the opportunity cost for sure, and think about whether, delay is something you can afford.
So a question we got in the chat while we're talking about realistic resourcing is, what about a realistic project timeline? Do you see project timelines needing to be tweaked when you are stepping up to an ERP implementation? And then I know the second part of this question that we're going to get into later is, talking into more detail about how you take rescue efforts and get back on course. But let's focus first on timelines.
On the timeline. So I mentioned earlier a milestone schedule, and we have a basic timeline that we can say rule of thumb from X to Y size company. This is what you can expect. The timeline will definitely be driven by the complexity of your organization and the number of departments that are working together, and really also by the number of customizations that you have to do. I think every ERP consultant will recommend that you minimize customizations out of the gate. Just try to go with the plain vanilla, which is why selection is super important. We can talk about that on another call. But if the timeline will change a little bit for sure, but I think it can be set from a milestone, basic high level, relatively early on, and it should be able to stay that way, provided some things are true. Like the core team is focused on this effort and not distracted by a lot of other things, that there are not a bunch of other priorities going on at your company simultaneously, right? So that is a conversation that really happens at the beginning when we use tools like a charter to get going on projects.
Yeah,
and I hope that answers the question.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you start talking about, the charter. I think when you're looking at a timeline, rather than just taking it for face value, understand, okay, what was the calculus behind this timeline? Like Andrea was talking about, the number of enhancements, the number of business domains, what was the calculus that led to that timeline being put in place? And that's a really good litmus test as to, is the vendor just throwing dates out there, or is there a reason why this timeline is set as it is?
And then so put me in a client's shoes. I start seeing some timelines, shift, and I start seeing the vendors drop some balls. Maybe there's a little scope creep coming on, and I reach out to you, Andrea. what do we talk about in that first meeting? What does that look like to really engage and, find out, do I have a problem?
Right. Thanks for asking. So this would again be for where we're coming in maybe midstream to a project. So when we come in midstream to a project, I think the one thing I want to make sure our clients fully appreciate is we don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? Like this, especially this last client we were talking about, they had done quite a bit of work, especially on their process flows. And they were really keen to make sure we weren't going to charge them to do that again, right? And so we're not interested in charging you to do something you've already done. We do have to come up to speed and learn it. And it'll take us a little bit of time to do that. And we're going to ask all those questions. And sometimes that helps to find some gaps. But we're going to really try to understand what is going on, how you got started in this project, who is involved, how big the project is, what other vendors you're integrating with, what your resources are. Do you have anything you can get off your plate that's maybe not your core competency, like writing reports, we've talked about this, or even outsourcing your IT department so that your IT people can focus on this high value work. So we just need to come in and really get to an understanding of where you've been and then where you're at and where we're going to go. And at that point, I think our standard process kind of can still be applicable. Again, not recreating work, but going through a charter and really understanding the scope, what's in scope, what's not in scope, getting everybody aligned to their roles, responsibilities, and expectations, having that discussion around a milestone schedule, because you're probably calling us since something has gone awry or there never was a schedule at all, and understanding what goes into that schedule, like you were saying before, Greg. And we also talk about two other things in our charter. One is, what are risks that could delay the schedule, maybe competing projects or areas we don't have expertise, and how can we mitigate those things, and what are some signs that those things are cropping up, and what are the change management aspects that we want to consider here. Whether a company, so we do both change management and project management. With bigger companies, they want someone maybe focused on each thing separately, because one is about driving schedule and getting tasks, very tactical. The other one's maybe more empathetic and changing behaviors and changing the hearts and minds of the team. But either way, there needs to be an aspect of that. And our project managers have been trained as change managers. They can do some of that too. So what's the communication plan? How are we going to bring everybody on board? Because the last thing you want is to pay a lot of money for your awesome new ERP, turn on the light switch, say go, and nobody knows how to use it. That would not be good.
Yeah, and I mean, that kind of reminds me of like back in the day, one of the tensions we would have on some projects is like, the organization's making this huge investment in ERPs, and they don't necessarily want to outsource that information to another vendor, right? Like they don't want to bring in a PM to go like, okay, you're going to gain all of this knowledge of our system that our people are going to be living in day to day. And like, what do you say to clients with those kind of concerns?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's very valid. You're spending a lot of money. There's going to be knowledge. You want to make sure it stays in-house. What I would say from our side is we don't purport to be the technical expert on your ERP. That's not actually why you're hiring us. We don't work for just one vendor. We're not pushing a line there. We work with a lot of different systems, and sure, we get to know some of them as we work with them. The project management, though, is very process, discipline, and tactics. So you're really not hiring us to do technical stuff. That's one thing. And then also from AJC's standpoint, we always want to make sure that all of the information stays with the client. So if we're helping you document your process flows, for example, you own those and they're yours. And oftentimes we will actually have maybe an email and get into your system, save them in your system. We're not keeping that stuff. It's your stuff. And with training plans and all of those things, we might help develop some of that, but we work very hard to make sure the client is actually doing that knowledge transfer. So we have subject matter experts, we have champions, we're partnering and coordinating and facilitating, but we aren't taking on that technical expertise role. So from our standpoint, the business, the client, they're really the experts in their business. All that knowledge, it started with them, it will stay with them, and we work very hard to make sure that they keep all of that knowledge about the system internally.
So
Yeah.
what you're saying, Andrea, is, maybe one of the top things, to know if you're going sideways is just a level of exposure the client may be getting. Like, are you feeling like you're not seeing the action happen? You're not part of the documentation process.
Mhm.
Is there some level of exposure you should be expecting? Like, let's say after the first few months, that that should be a red flag.
Yeah, I mean, if you are being told that the vendor is going to just say, hey, here's how you're going to do it, and we're not going to try and make sure it works for your company, that would be a red flag. I don't know that that really happens, though. I think it's maybe the opposite. So,
But there's certain things that they should be getting exposure to, such as maybe helping write some of the documentation or write enhancements to the documentation as the project is going.
yeah, and I think a lot of companies forget about that documentation, or it's hard to prioritize writing down how things need to happen when you're just so busy making it happen. So again, if you have a project manager who says things like, well, let's make sure all our processes are documented so we have things to reference, or as we go through training, let's record those sessions and put them on our SharePoint sites for further, reference later. Somebody to kind of think about that from the long-term perspective and help the client be putting that type of information together and thinking about it from that standpoint. It is a red flag to think that you're just going to do this and not document any of that stuff. And if you aren't being exposed or being asked to put something down or make a video or do whatever to keep that information in-house, that's a red flag.
Got it.
And then I know you kind of talked a little bit about the team charter, but are there like other components to the AJC approach to ERP?
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Yeah.
I love the charter. I recognize that it can be a bit of maybe an archival type document or an artifact, but I think it's very, very useful. It's a tool that helps get everybody on the same page at the beginning of a project, even if we came in on the middle. So, I'm a big believer. After that, we always do an operating agreement for the groups that are working together closely. So there's typically a core team involved with an ERP implementation, usually comprised of subject matter experts who are able to devote a good % of their time to the project. And we talk about at the beginning how we're going to work together. And we use the operating agreement as that tool. So how often are we going to meet? What days? What's the schedule? What's the forum? What's, the agenda? We have a standard kind of agenda that we use. I'll talk about what are the expectations for action item completion, right? Not always a favorite thing. And if you don't have somebody who's keeping you accountable, you can just keep, oh yeah, I'm supposed to have gotten that done. Haven't done it yet. Oh, this got in the way. Oh, this, that. We say, okay, here's the process. If it's not done within this time, then we give you that much more time, but it's escalated. And at some point it's going up, and we will talk about that escalation path together so that it's clear what we're going to do if things start slipping. And then vacation schedules. How many people have been on a project where you're trying to do something with the team and then all of a sudden, it's summer now and everybody's taking their weeks off, which is great. I'm a fan of vacation, but it's very helpful to know and plan around that time so that you don't plan for your conference room pilot when 3 of your people are out for the week, right? So we talk about that. And then, as I mentioned, with our ongoing meetings, Barry talked about traction and EOS. We use similar to the L10 agenda. So every week we come in, we check in, we'll look at the milestone schedule, then we'll look at the detailed schedule or specific things that need to happen to achieve the next milestone. We talk a bit about the adoption pulse within the company, how everybody's feeling about things, give that a bit of time. Go through the action item list and what hasn't yet gotten done, talk about escalation if necessary, but we save the bulk of the time for what we call issues. So these are the things that are coming up through the weeks that haven't been resolved. They're surprises, they're new. Oh gosh, we're doing dynamics and they've just updated the system and we need to refresh our user environment or something like that, right? So we'll talk about those issues and we list them out and we say, what's the highest priority items that we need to get discussed? And we'll talk about those first until we figure out how to resolve them, which will turn into more action items or another meeting offline with some different subject matter experts or something like that, right? So the point, though, is that we're moving forward, talking about the most important things first and getting those resolved. So that's a tool that we use pretty heavily. And then we have other things, change logs, risk mitigation logs, stuff like that, that we can bring in when they're necessary.
Question popped up, and I thought it was a really good one. Is the approach any different when you're going from greenfield, totally new system versus upgrading from something within the same vendor ecosystem? Are there things that you will need to focus on in one type of flavor of implementation versus the other? Is it the same tools? But yeah, I thought that was a great point to bring up, Dan.
That is a great point. Thanks, Dan. I would say from a project management and project organization standpoint, the same tools. Hopefully, because you've done this before, you understand maybe the roles, responsibilities within your company a little better. And maybe you've outsourced some of your things before to report writers or various companies that you can identify up front. So it might streamline some of the things, but being aligned and on the same page and figuring out how you're going to work together, that's always important.
Yeah, and what I've seen, the fact that we work within the Microsoft ecosystem, sometimes you bring assumptions along from what worked in your last system from the same vendor to the next. And sometimes those assumptions are totally not found or totally different.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, as Andrea is saying, is you want to kind of think of it as a blank slate, no matter what you're doing, whether it's an upgrade or a greenfield approach. You want to make sure you just focus a lot on the pre-planning. You ask the tough questions, and you also ask the questions you think might be stupid or might be redundant, because you might find out that your assumptions weren't correct.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that a little bit. One, I'll say we're happy to ask the stupid questions on your behalf. We have no problem with that. And that's also kind of a benefit of not, being the technical expert. We have no worry about looking inferior because we don't know the answer to a technical question. So if you're scared to ask that question, we're happy to ask it. The other thing I would say, back on the assumptions point, we're actually doing an implementation right now where someone's going from an on-prem version of the software into a cloud version of the same software. And they assumed, because it was the same vendor, the same software, that the look and feel would be very similar. And they're now finding with the first round of navigation training that that is not the case. And so I think, yeah, you have to throw the assumptions right out the window and get the proof in the pudding, right? Take a look at it, because it could be very different. Your whole team will be assuming it's going to be easy because it's the same vendor, and it's not. So you have to prepare them for that, which takes a little bit longer. So yeah, that's a unique challenge and has to be considered. Thanks for bringing that up.
So true. I mean, it's so funny. Even a minute difference between on-prem to a web of the same exact branded product can feel like apples and oranges. I mean, we see that all the time too.
Yeah, absolutely. And then kind of putting myself back in that client's shoes, we're concerned about current implementation schedule. What would you recommend that I start focusing on and thinking about if I'm kind of in that seat?
If you're worried about schedule, I think you need to look at all of the things on the plates of the team members who are working on this project. So again, we have a client right now. They are doing a lot of their own development internally, and that's terrific. But the person who's responsible for that has about 5 or 6 other competing priorities. And it's very, very challenging. So if you're worried about schedule, you need, I guess, what's the adage? When everything is important, then nothing is, right? Yeah. If this is important to you and your company, you're spending a lot of money on it, you got to put the time in it's going to take. And I won't say that hiring an outsourced project manager is a panacea and it's just going to magically make this thing work like clockwork. That's not actually true. Everybody's got to be on the team together and everybody's got to be focused. The project manager will certainly help. And we fully appreciate you have your day jobs, but you can't have a lot of high priority competing work. If you're worried about schedule, take a look at all the other things on your plate and make some hard decisions.
Got it. Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that this kind of brings to mind is we'll often be in this place where, we'll have clients come to us after, say, a big 4 vendor came in and really used a lot of their budget. And now they're going, okay, we have way less budget and we're off track. How can you guys fix this? And, we get creative, we figure out things to do and how we can kind of get things back on track. But there is just the reality that once you've burnt that budget, it's burnt. And so how, as a client, do you know when to hit that big red stop button?
Yeah. I think it comes back to your priorities and looking at your long-term goals and how this is going to fit in. So I'll give a story. I was involved in an ERP that was going from a nothing, right? Like spreadsheets and QuickBooks and sort of the modern version of duct tape and baling wire to an ERP system for the first time. And fortunately, we used the ROC system, which is like the Covey, put the high priority things first. And we said during this implementation time, the only thing that our core team, other than their day job, is worried about is this implementation. That's it. And we used a lot of Agile stuff. So we did daily huddles. You know, that's a really great way. If you want your thing to go faster, just start talking to everybody every day, sometimes twice a day, right? What did you do yesterday? What do you have on track for today? What help do you need? 15-minute phone call, that's it. So if you feel like, you know, everything's off track, you don't really have a budget, you're not sure where it's going, I would push that stop button, like you said, spend some focused time with your leadership team and decide on your priorities, and then pull some of those levers to get other stuff off the plate. Use some of those tactics like the daily huddles and the organized meetings. If you can't afford an outsourced project manager, designate somebody inside. That also can work, right? And I've got some advice on how to do that. But you need to get focused and make some decisions and just prioritize those things. I can't stress it enough.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then I think we're going to open it up for questions here in a second, but and we'll kind of come back to this, but like, if anyone's sitting there going like, hey, you guys are describing me, how would they get a hold of you to learn more?
Well, I think you've got a slide with my email, but it's my website, AndreaJonesConsulting.com. And the email is pretty easy. It's Andrea@AndreaJonesConsulting.com. Plus, you can actually get a hold of us from the site directly. You know, Barry, I wanted to just touch back with you before we go to some of these other questions, which is, you know, how's it going with the client we were talking about, right? We came in and started working with them. You're their account manager. You want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the project's going real well. I mean, when we got involved, it was pretty off the rails, you know, there was an expectation that the vendor's project manager was going to be helping things along, and that didn't happen. And so, you know, the first thing that we did was, you know, sit down and go through the schedule. We actually got to put a schedule together. We've adjusted the go live date, and now we're working to that date. It's a realistic date that both the company and the vendor feels that we can hit. And we're going through our weekly L10s, as Andrea had mentioned earlier, what the milestone 90-day rocks or milestones are, and then going through our issues list every week. And I would tell you that I feel we will probably beat our go live date. And I think it's because we're all into this together. The vendor, the vendor's PM, the AJC PM, which is managing the client team. And because we're all working together, we all have a schedule. I feel we'll probably beat that go live date by a month or two.
Amazing.
And I did just share the slide that Andrea Jones Consulting Team will be providing a complimentary 1-hour assessment of wherever your current ERP implementation or system implementation is at. So definitely take advantage of that and reach out to Andrea or give her team a call. And with that, I believe, Gavin, we are transitioning over to the QA period.
Yeah, so you know, it's kind of open Q&A now. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we can call on you. And you know, you can drop off mute. You can just plop it in the chat if that's easier for you, and we'll give like people a couple minutes to get going there. You know, and I'll just kind of prime the pump while we're waiting for other people to hop in. Where do you, Barry and Andrea, think people underestimate the complexity or the different tasks in a project the most.
Well, I'll give you my opinion.
Go ahead, Derek.
One piece that is underestimated or overlooked is the change management piece. We were talking to a client last week that implemented an ERP 2 years ago. They admit they didn't do a very good job with the change management, and now it's 2 years later and they're not getting full use out of the ERP because they overlooked the change management. So making sure that people are on board, people understand the new system, know how to use it, is super important. And I think Andrew said earlier, you want to get the bang for your buck, and a lot of times companies aren't getting the full value of that expense because not everybody is fully utilizing the system for what it offers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Did you have another answer, Andrea?
I think that's a huge one. And thank you, Barry, for that. I was going to talk about the data migration. I already mentioned it a little bit, though, but I do think there is, to me, data migration, you can think of it with the analogy of moving. A lot of times people think when they change to move houses, they're going to use that as an opportunity to throw out all the stuff that's accumulated in their junk drawer, and really all they're taking to their new house is what they really need. When it comes down to it, though, gosh, it's really hard because it takes time and trying to decide if you keep your kids' homework from 2nd grade or not, because gosh, it was so cute, whatever it is. It's time and it's effort. And so what people end up doing is throwing all the stuff in the junk drawer into boxes and taking it with them anyway, right? So I think the data migration is something that's often underestimated. And then, I'll ask you guys, I'm sure, I see reporting as an underestimated area too. Everybody thinks they've got this new system, all their information will be in a single source of truth now. And wow, it's going to be so easy to get anything they need from a data standpoint. But shoot, they didn't think about how to extract it and how to view it and who's going to look at it and how it's got to be massaged. I mean, you have anything to add there?
Oh, I think that's a really great point. And there is an ERP system is not synonymous with a data warehouse. And just because you have a bright, shiny new ERP system doesn't mean that the data that you're putting into there is going to be clean, or the processes are super solid as you first included this system. And funny enough, a lot of ERP systems, they may have a data reporting tool part of it. They may have something that comes along with the system itself for you to understand what's going on in the system. But that doesn't mean you're going to get a holistic view of anything outside of that ERP system. I have heard so many times, I think people assume that the ERP system will become all-encompassing when in reality it never will be. And so having a plan for that data backend, having a plan as to, okay, how are we going to get the historical data? Are we going to be able to view that without having to pay an arm and a leg to migrate data into this ERP system? There are so many different data solutions that can be worked up, but if it's not a forethought, you're going to be surprised once it becomes an afterthought. And Gavin, I don't know if there's anything you can add there.
Yeah, and this is where I'll start banging my strategy drum, is that, a data warehouse and an ERP just in and of themselves aren't all that valuable. It actually has to change the way people do work, and that's what drives business value. And so, you should have an idea of, what do we want to measure? And especially when it comes to supply chain measurements, they should be simple and easy to understand. And so understanding, what is manufacturing lead time shouldn't be some huge long calculation that's an algorithm based on each facility and each plant. It should be a very clear, this start date, this end date, that's it. And a lot of places don't really take the time to do that ahead of time. And so you get, analysts at the end of the day going, wouldn't it be cool if I presented it this way? And it makes sense, when you're kind of sitting alone in an office to do that. But it really does pay dividends. It's that stitch and time saves 9 thing. It pays dividends to think about it ahead of time and really go towards that North Star rather than figuring out your North Star along the way.
Absolutely. And I think we had a great question by Maria asking about, there are so many ERP systems out in the wild. And, there are ERP systems that are focused on small versus medium versus large shops. How do you know what to go for? And, I think there are, to the strategic end, you want to know what are your absolute must-haves and what is your North Star? And then start aligning with what is out on the market, because you want to look at the systems out there as more of, okay, well, what's this point system I'm trying to adopt? It's, well, what does this vendor have and what is their ecosystem? Is it an ecosystem play? Are there other points within this ecosystem that I could see us adopting? Is this, and that's one side of the spectrum of some of the larger players who have that ecosystem versus some of the smaller players that might be very industry specific, might be very process specific, and a very point solution. And you want to know, okay, at what point does that solution end, and what point does another, system within my current business pick up the slack? And so, within those two spectrums, you want to know, you want to be very strategic as to the vendor you're selecting, what they're capable of, and, what problem you're trying to solve. So, and Andrea said, don't buy the Lexus if you really need the Corolla.
Right.
And so that's what, the pre-planning and knowing your North Star before you get into this mix is so important, because you will always tend to go and buy the Lexus if you haven't figured out, where your needs really lie.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that.
I'll just add that we have a pretty robust systems selection process that I'm happy to share. I don't think it's rocket science, and I do think you can possibly, do it yourself, or at least take a look at it. But it all centers around finding out what your wish list and your needs to have list are. So you come up with that nice long list. What do you absolutely have to have? What's just a nice to have? And then you start looking and doing research. We did one recently. It took us about 3 months, but we did this whole process. We went from, I think there were 35 systems possible for this mid-sized company. And once we compared them to our absolute needs to have, we narrowed it down to maybe, I think, 11 to 15. Then did the first pass phone call just to ask them a little bit more. The project manager did that so the team didn't have to worry. Narrowed that down to 5 and took that 5 down to 3 and then down to 1, right? So you do that over the course of weeks. You have demos, you ask questions, you've got to consider implementation timelines, the resources they have, the costs that they have, et cetera. But there is a process to do this selection, and it's pretty straightforward, I think.
The selection process is an important step. I feel like a lot of times, again, the selection process and pre-planning are very glossed over. And, Jacqueline was saying, Andrea Jones Consulting, do you work with companies who are trying to make that decision between, the vendor selection process? And the answer, I believe, is a resounding yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And Maria, there are no stupid questions. And so Maria's asking, what is your definition of ERP? Sounds like Maria's background is in manufacturing, and I believe MRP is kind of the same. Is synonymous with ERP. I know E is for enterprise, M may be for manufacturing.
Yeah, E is for the enterprise resource planning system and is for the materials resource planning system. So the MRP is typically fewer modules than an enterprise system. So with an ERP, you might get like a CRM, for example, a customer resource management system that's integrated into the ERP. With an MRP, you're less likely to have that type of thing.
Yeah, and you want to think of whether it's an ERP, MRP, or whatever system you're implementing. The way I like to think of them is this is where transactions are occurring. And this is a system that's going to record transactions. It's where the data is being stored from those transactions. And it's also how you're going to kick off what your business processes or actions based on a certain type of transaction. And that's why that's why an ERP system is not synonymous with the data warehouse, because when you want to start slicing and dicing your data and understand holistically where your business is at, it's so different than a transactional system. So, you're going to have a different game plan as to how you implement your transaction system, and then also a different game plan as to how the data is being used to further, insights, forecasting, what have you.
Yeah, and hopefully a good integration. I will also say, in an ERP, there's an accounting system as well, and that can be a huge aspect. And one anecdotal thing, so the company we recently selected with, and now we're implementing their ERP, they had a very old system for their transactions, a data warehouse that was non-existent, and then they bought a CRM on top of that, and it turned out they were spending just as much money on the annual fees for the CRM as they were for this old ERP, MRP, whatever system. The new one that we selected with their team has both aspects, and they can get rid of the CRM they were paying for. They were only using about 20% of it anyway. So probably for the next 5 to 10 years, the one-stop shop system that will cost just the same as their current system is all that they need to do both of those things. So they're basically having their ongoing, cost structure. So it's great.
Yeah, and I think that's the point also when you're looking at vendors, I was trying to make with ecosystem, right? Like, is this system you're buying come with packaged all these different modules that you may be able to take advantage of and start, sunsetting some of your older legacy systems. And for us, one thing we're seeing is this craze around, low code applications, ways that you can, like fill the gaps. If this ecosystem or this vendor you're signing on to has ways that you can really own, enhancing or expanding the scope of, what you currently get out of the box. I think that's so important to be flexible because businesses change, and industries change. And so being able to adopt a system, but also having a plan for, well, if things change, am I going to be able to own this customization? Am I going to be able to work with a low code or high code platform to be able to continually expand? If things are changing, you want to definitely be thinking about that. Any other questions we might have? Again, audience, feel free to jump off mute, ping some questions.
I want to offer one thing, and of course, if there's any other questions, but I did promise that I would tell you what I think you should have in a project manager, whether they are outsourced or in-house. And then, Chris, we can get to that question. So here are the 4 things that I think that your project managers should do, regardless of whether they're in or out. Your project manager needs to be focused on the project. That means there's nothing else they're responsible for that is a higher priority than this project. Your project manager needs to be able to put aside any silos or political or differences of opinion or whatever and focus on the whole team and bring them all along together. So they really need to be sort of apolitical, maybe. Your project manager should have the ability to continue to follow up after go live for, I would say, 4 to 8 weeks of what we call hypercare. And that would be, turning something on, no matter how well you've planned and how well you've tested, there's still going to be bugs and issues, and somebody has to take point on that. So don't think that, oh, schedule's done, project manager, I can put them on something else. They have to be available a little bit after. And the last piece would be to really keep that end user audience in mind. And maybe that gets to Chris's question a little bit about resistance, but the project manager has to represent the interests of the whole company. And so I would say your project manager has to also have a little bit of change management in them to think, how do we make sure that the ROI is going to be there, that everybody's ready to do this once we go live, right? So those 4 things: they're dedicated, there's nothing else. They're free of silos and politics. They can stay on for at least 4 to 6 weeks after, 4 to 8 weeks after, and they're thinking about the end users, those things.
And I love Chris's.
Can I add to that as well?
Sorry, Barry.
when you look at the project manager, and this may sound like a sales plug, and it's not meant to be, is that one of the things Andrew talked about is being apolitical or being neutral, and the project or the account I'm managing right now, the rescue, one of the difficulties they were having is having an internal project manager, because it was hard for that person to stay neutral. And it was also hard because some team members looked at that person as not being neutral. And so getting an outside third party PM, those kind of political skeletons or all those things aren't there. The PM's there to manage the project. They're not going to be there continuing to work with those people, and they have to develop the relationship with the team when they're working, but when the project's over, they're going to move on. And so I'll tell you, I've seen that in several cases just in my own in the private sector, where it's just difficult for a project manager who's internal to stay neutral. They have history, they know people. So that's something to consider, whether it's internal or external.
All great points. And what might be fun for the last 5 minutes is maybe picking on some of those business domains on the different patterns of resistance we may see. I think I can speak to some of what I've seen around like IT and finance. I don't know if there's any specific ones that you guys see more often than not.
I'll let you go ahead.
Okay. Well, what I've seen, at least with an IT-led project, means, okay, well, who owns this? Because IT typically wants to say we want to own less. And if we want to own more, there's got to be a really rigid process. We have to know the security. I think the resistance you see from IT sometimes tries to lock down the system a little bit more than you're going to need to be able to be flexible as a business. So, although, security is very important, and I think IT needs are very important, do not let a project become IT led, because you may not get what your business needs at the end of it. And so those are some patterns I see with IT. I think when it becomes finance led, what I've seen, patterns of resistance being, of course, budget, and, budget being a driver of everything sometimes locks down the type of, new ideas or some of the ways to reinvent what you've been doing every single time in the past. If you become too finance led of the project, those are the patterns I see. Is it's either just never gets off the ground, or if it doesn't allow enough holistic view as to where we're trying to go.
Or you get to like a level of, I was just gonna say, especially with finance, you get to this level of granularity where it'll be like, well, what's the ROI of this one specific marketing dashboard, and develop a story for that. And it's like, well, it's a 20-hour project. There's a lot of value in empowering marketing, but to nail everything down to very specific granular ROI can be really challenging.
Really challenging, really expensive, and really time consuming, and gets you away from your North Star. I mean, there are some gut instincts when you're trying to steer the ship of the business that you can't sit there and get very granular on the ROI. So I think that's a really important finance-led thing that we see.
And I'll interject with, oh, sorry.
Nope, go for it.
I read this book a few years ago, and it's called Flawless Consulting, and it was written by Peter Block. And he talks a lot about different styles of resistance, and it's very much written from a consultant client standpoint. But I think if you take a look at it, and I'll drop in the chat a link to a piece that kind of outlines the different forms of resistance. It really does apply in internal relationships as much as it applies to vendor-client relationships. I think the person to always be most wary of is not the person who's actively resistant and you can hear, because you can manage those people. It's the people who are silently resistant that you can't manage. And so it's like trying to identify those people and identifying where you might have, resistance that just isn't surfacing is the challenge.
Yep. And I think
I'd like to, sorry, I think we have just 1 minute. I want to be sure to thank you guys again for hosting this, and thank everybody for joining. And I think we probably need to wrap up, but I do have one small story I'd like to offer to this group, which is, something like an ERP implementation actually can really bring a team together it's a great opportunity to do something super important together. And if you can approach it in that way, that we're all in it together, then I think that you come out on the other end stronger and better off because of it. And one thing I did in an implementation I led, everybody did such a hardworking job that at the end, I went on Amazon, I ordered a case of 100-gram bars, and I went around to everybody in the organization and I said, you know, thank you so much for all your hard work. I want to give you a big bonus. So here's what I'm going to give you is 100 grand, right? So just something little like that can really just show your appreciation for people's hard work and going above and beyond, and it can really bring people together.